We're now going to turn to our second speaker for the opposition, Michael Lawson-Falomo. Michael is a first-year undergraduate reading HSPS at St. John's College. He won the right to speak through open audition. Michael, the floor is yours.
Hello, so it's my first time speaking in the chamber, and this is a topic that's really, really important and close to my heart. And I think the first thing we have to say and notice is that we're not arguing that intervention should never happen, but we're arguing that historically it has been bad and has not been a force for good. We have to analyze examples in order to see whether it has been a force for good or not, and that's mainly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to focus on 3 points. I'm going to speak about the malicious intent behind Western intervention, the consequences of Western intervention, and its double standards and cherry picking, in order to try and convince you that Western intervention has not been a force for good. Firstly, it's malicious intent. You see, Western intervention is always guised as a moral mission and a need to civilize and liberalize to free people from grips of genocide, terrorism, and non-democratic regimes, a trend that has existed since 1492 when Christopher Columbus first set sail. The first speaker of the proposition mentioned that there's a defense of liberal democracy, but why should that be the political model of the world? Surely culture is relative. Surely culture is more complex, as the first speaker of the opposition mentioned. Really and truly, there is an ulterior motive to these interventions, and these motives are far-reaching and sometimes justifiable, but they're always surrounded around the realist acquisition of power and wealth. Western intervention essentially acts as a form of neo-imperialism perpetuated by the global hegemon, currently the United States. And this is in order to maintain its control over international relations and is of course backed by the likes of the UK and France, desperate to maintain their international relevance. No, thank you. So the Middle East and North Africa, or MENA, is a prime example of the region of the world that has faced Western intervention with ulterior motives. Some argue that this tension between East and West is a religious one, going all the way back to the Crusades, a feud between Christian states and Islamic ones, but really it's a feud of repackaged colonizers desiring to erode Arab and Persian sovereignty, all for resources. Especially during the World Wars, control of the Middle Eastern oil fields was vital to the British victory in particular. Prime Minister Macmillan said in 1957, a couple years after the war, that Middle Eastern oil was the biggest prize in the world. A prize to be hunted, to be sought for by any means possible. No, thank you. And when the British were replaced by the Americans, they also followed this exact same philosophy. You see, a correction must be made. For states like the US that are largely energy self-sufficient, Western intervention is not about access to energy, it's about control. 1991, the first Gulf War between Iraq and Kuwait over territory and oil disputes, and it saw the West get involved in the horrors that were occurring in Iraq. You see, they set up no-fly zones, which, as somebody did mention, did sort of work, but really and truly, these sanctions not only destabilized and caused horrors in Iraq, but also it was mainly all for the acquisition of resources. 2003, an illegal unilateral invasion to disarm Iraq of alleged nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons of mass destruction. Over 500,000 deaths later, we find out from intelligence that the intelligence that was given was not mistaken, but was in fact fraudulent. And this was known information. In the Downing Street memo, we found out from Foreign Minister Straw that the case was thin and that Saddam Hussein was not threatening his neighbors and his weapons of mass destruction capacity was less than that of Libya, North Korea, or Iran, yet the invasion still occurred. All for what? Resources and control. 2011, Libya. Gaddafi announces that he wishes to change Libyan reserves from the dollars. A few weeks later, NATO, the puppet of the US, no thank you, suddenly notices his human rights offenses and decides to intervene. How convenient. The intent is not pure. It is too often driven by a desire to gain something, and the Middle East and North Africa are a perfect example of this. Western intervention has been a force for greed. Go ahead.
That was a disingenuous summary of what was happening in Libya. Libya was on the verge of civil war, intervention or not. Gaddafi was preparing to march on the capital Benghazi with massive protesters.
Yes.
Can you please put aside this ridiculous pretense that Obama's intervention was motivated by?
I think... Now, I do recognize what was going on in Libya. Yes, he was about to march, but I don't think it's a ridiculous pretension. I think it's very much true, and there is some truth to it. And I think sort of just cherry-picking what you want to take and what you think to be true is the wrong way to go about this argument. Now, onto the consequences of Western intervention. In theory, Western intervention is a great idea. For most of modern history, due to theft and plundering of resources from the global south, the West has been more economically developed. So logically, it would make more sense for them to extend an altruistic hand to help those who can't translate their money into military wealth or lack enough capital to do so altogether. However, as with most political theories, this doesn't really work as smoothly in practice. Due to the aforementioned malicious intent behind Western intervention, it too frequently translates into negative consequences. Entire regions of the world destabilized, communities torn apart, cultures disrespected, economies destroyed, all for the liberal lie of cultural homogeneity and an insatiable quest for power. Syria, a case familiar with all of us. A civil war turned into a failed state due to the poisoned hand of the West. No, thank you. I'm not here to say that the West was the cause of the Syrian civil war and dictated the initial terrors of the Assad regime, but rather what was supposed to be an intervention to help and support the Syrian people against terrorism and despotism turned into a boys' club proxy war. Airstrikes and the structural failures of the UN Security Council have led to the perpetuance of a war and have turned a nation of rich cultural heritage and people into a pile of rubble and debris, fled by over 13 million people and claiming the lives of over 400,000. For almost 18 years, UN peacekeepers have been in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But many seem to be confused about what they're actually there to do: provide peace and not incite terror. 2010. A 14-year-old girl, orphaned by conflict, finds her way to a camp protected by UN peacekeepers. But instead of being kept safe, she is raped and left impregnated. Although she reported it, she never got any help from the UN. Of over 2,000 sexual abuse and exploitation complaints made to the UN between 2010 and 17, 700 occurred in Congo. Somalia, 1992. The US led a military operation for humanitarian intervention and peacekeeping efforts in Somalia, which led to the Battle of Mogadishu, in which thousands of Somali fighters and civilians were killed. This intervention led to the festering of internal conflicts and failed intervention attempts to catch the likes of IDID, which has left the country engulfed in clan civil war, destabilizing it and leading it to failed status. The consequences of intervention have often been negative. That is not to say that some have not benefited from Western aid, but surely if there are millions that can attest to Western intervention causing the failures of their homes, it is almost morally questionable to say that Western intervention has been a force for good. Western intervention has been a force for destruction. Now, no thank you. And onto the cherry picking and double standards of Western intervention. Western intervention is malicious in intent, and this leads to negative consequences. The falsehood of Western intervention, the creation of a universalistic standard of human rights and equality, is not only just anything but universalistic in Western choice of intervention, but also incredibly ironic. The Rwandan genocide of 1994 is one of the greatest examples of the failures of Western intervention, and was even a driver for the UN's creation of responsibility to protect. Over 500,000 Tutsi deaths could have arguably been prevented if the UN acted earlier. Their action was delayed by the US, who were preoccupied destroying Somalia to drive action in aid for Rwanda. Western intervention is extremely selective and driven by factors such as leadership, like Blair with Kosovo, the CNN factor stimulating body bag syndrome, and national self-interest. Western intervention is designed to defend human rights. Okay, so why, despite evidence, has the UN, US, or UK not intervened in China? Xi Jinping is actively imprisoning and infringing on the rights of thousands of Uyghur Muslims, but we hear nothing but silence from the West. No, thank you. The ICC, another arm of intervention and institutionalism, designed to convict crimes against humanity. The ICC has only ever convicted 3 people, and guess where they're from? The continent of Africa. Is that to say that Africa has no human rights, or is the breeding ground for dictators, or that Africans are simply driven to violence and barbarism? No, thank you. This is the same West that kills its black and brown people and whose police officers can fix their knees on civilians for 8 minutes, leading to asphyxia, all for the sake of a banknote, or are still beholden to draconian laws. This is the same West that attacks entire religions and its people for decisions, all because it doesn't ascribe to their own beliefs. I mean, Guantanamo Bay is still open. When will the ICC put all the many failed Western leaders on trial for their crimes? Surely we must analyze ourselves. No, thank you. Surely we must analyze ourselves before looking at others. Western intervention has not been a force for good because it's cherry picking and it's double standards. Universal means universal, not non-Western and when convenient. Western intervention has been a force for neo-imperialism.
On that point,
Go ahead.
what you describe as convenience, like it's inconvenient for us to invade China, is just acknowledging an international reality, but that wouldn't do anybody any good because it would destroy us a whole world of pain. When intervention has been targeted, it's been specific and limited. And those cases are not analogous to cases of, say, just invading China.
I'm not necessarily asking. I think that's a very, very good point.
I make a point of information to the gentleman who just made a point of information.
Point of order, no.
Okay. What I wanted to say was that's a very good point. And I'm not arguing that the UK should just invade China, but I'm saying recognize what is going on with the Uyghur Muslims in China. And if you want to say that you want to intervene for human rights and you have a universalistic standard, why pick and choose? Who decides and who has better human rights than someone else? No, thank you. I need to conclude. Sorry. To conclude, I think that you need to consider every single case in order to make a comprehensive conclusion. And we're not trying to say that Western intervention should never happen or is that it's just this terrible thing. We're trying to say that Western intervention historically has not been a force for good. And we think that morally is very... No, thank you, sorry. We think that morally it is not a convincing argument to say that it has been a force for good. And I hope when you leave today, you vote for side no. I'm opposition. Thank you.